Hey everybody, it's Monday of week 4 of period 4. It's actually the third week of instruction because last week was the school break that started off with the King's Day. So I hope you had a restful and enjoyable few days off. Probably we all needed it because this, as we've discussed, this shift to online instruction only is stressful for everybody. So this is the week 3 lecture, and as we've been doing, I'm going to mount this lecture on YouTube, and then I also will make available to you the slide deck for this lecture, which I have on my laptop right here. I'll be occasionally looking in that direction for my PowerPoint notes. And then I'll send that around by email, and also I'll mount that on Teams, the PowerPoint. The problem, of course, is that the video files seem to be too large to mount on Teams. Maybe that's just me, or maybe I'm not doing something right. All right, so let's get started. So the topic is group behavior in organizations, and it's a very important topic because so much of what happens in organizations these days revolves around effective groups and teams. And there is a difference in those two terms, a group and a team. They're different. But for the moment, let's not worry too much about that. So for the moment, let's just think about a team as a high-functioning group, a very, very effectively working group. But what's a group? All right, well, the first slide will tell you that. So the first slide is titled Groups and Group Identity. And a group is two or more individuals who are interacting and interdependent. They rely on each other, who come together to achieve specific goals. Now, I want to take a moment and kind of talk about this definition. Most specialists in team or group communication will say that 3 is actually the minimum number for a group because we want to kind of reserve 2 as the number to associate with relationship. So a relationship is 2 people who are interacting in some established patterns. Not 1 person, not 3, but 2. Groups, however, start with 3 people. However, this definition is the one I was given when I started this semester at Hahn, and I want to honor that. But I'm just wanting to tell you that 3 is probably a good way to think about the smallest number of people in a group. Once you got 3, then you got the beginnings of you got a group. We talk about how group identity is stronger than organizational identity many times, most of the time. Let's explain that for a moment. One feature of groups is that a group is usually part of a larger organization. Not always, but most of the time, if you have a group, especially when you talk about a work group, a group of people who work together, generally they're 3 or more individuals up to a certain ceiling, by the way. There's not just 3 or more into the millions. It's 3 up to a certain number. We're going to talk about that. The identity that you have as a member of a group is often stronger than the identity you have as a member of the organization, as strong as that may be. So a great example of this is many years ago I was reading an autobiography written by a guy who was a paratrooper in World War II, an American paratrooper, and he talked about how he was a member with these 2 other guys. I can't remember their names. His name was Ken, let's say Jim and Bob. So Ken, Jim, and Bob formed what Ken called an entity. And he said, we would do anything for each other. If one of us didn't have any food, the other 2 would give him some of their food. If one of us got into a fight with someone, the other 2 guys jumped in and participated in the fight. We would do anything for each other. We were willing to die for each other. If it meant saving the lives of the other 2, each of us was willing to give up his life. This was a very, very close bond. And he said, as proud as we were to be members of the 101st Airborne Division, we really were close to each other, and we really took our identity from being this entity, as he called it. And he said there were dozens and dozens of such entities throughout the division. The division was 12,000 paratroopers. Dozens and dozens of these entities. So each member of each of these entities most likely really felt closest and had closer identification with his entity, his group, than with the very well-known, very celebrated division as a whole. So that's what we mean by group identity is often stronger than organizational identity. We talk about two types of groups, formal groups, informal groups. Formal groups are groups that are sort of officially recognized by the organization. An example at the Han might be there is a group of people. Some of the people are Yetcha, Aryan, 3, 4, 5 others, and they're kind of this leadership group. They're the key leaders of the Han International School of Business. And they're a formal group in the sense of, they're identified as the leadership group, the leadership team is what they're called. Formal, official. And then on the other hand, there's a group of several of us who go out every Friday to have beer at Local 99. We go out to Local 99 at about 5 o'clock. We have a few beers. We don't, ever since the shutdown occurred. But, for the first several weeks that I was here, January through early March, every Friday night, or almost every Friday night, we get together. It was the same 4 or 5 people. One of the last, I think it was probably the last Friday night we were able to do it, I started out by having some beer with one group, the group that I always had the beer with, the 4 of us. And then they all went home, and I wasn't ready to leave. I saw another group. It was other instructors from the IB program. And I knew them, so I came over and, hey, Dave, have a seat. So I became a member, at least briefly, a member of that group. 2 almost identical groups in just about every way, except they were 2 groups. They weren't together. And informal. Doesn't show up on the organization chart, isn't officially required that you have a Friday Frymibo group. Next slide is titled Examples of Formal Work Groups. A couple of things to think about here. Command groups, these are members of a command group, usually work together in a particular department, and the manager of that department sort of puts them together to engage in some particular set of tasks, activities. A task group, even though I used the word tasks a moment ago to talk about command group, a task group is made up of members of various departments, and they come together to do a project or whatever the activity may be. We also have a concept called cross-functional teams. And a big difference here between cross-functional teams and a task group is that oftentimes in a cross-functional team, all the members of the team are trained in the work of another member of the group. So, someone in the cross-functional team may be sick or may not be able to come to work for a week or 2. All right, someone else has already kind of learned much of what that person does and can kind of do it. We see cross-functional teams for example, many years ago I used to work as a consultant full-time. And I worked with a group of people from a team of people, a cross-functional team, from a company called Litton Industries. And they would build and set up very, very expensive, large-scale, complex warehousing systems. And you had cross-functional teams selling this stuff. So the sales specialist would initiate the process of selling these systems, and then once the prospective client became a client, then you had the other members of the cross-functional team come in, and the sales specialist was kind of the main point of contact with the client, but you had an accounting specialist, a hardware, a software, a manufacturing specialist, a logistics expert. And these 5 or 6 people form this cross-functional team. And in most cases, if one of the people couldn't make a meeting, someone else would know just enough about whatever that particular specialty was to be able to talk intelligently in the meeting. Even though, I'm not an accountant, I know enough about accounting and the accountant's tasking in this cross-functional team that I can kind of take over for him or her, at least briefly. And then we have self-managed teams. Self-managed teams are teams that are not really overseen much, if at all, by people who are in management or executive positions outside the team. So even that cross-functional team involved with selling those expensive systems, they were kind of managed by the sales manager in the organization. But a self-managed team, they're pretty much, whoa, oh, gosh, sorry. They're managed by one another. And an example of this might be some design teams. Design teams in various industries are often kind of off on their own. There's a famous group in Lockheed Aviation, manufacturing airplanes. And they were called the Skunk Works. That was the nickname of this group. They were a design group, a design team. They were a self-managed team. They went off and they did their own designs, and they came up with these magnificent designs for new types of aircraft. But they were self-managed. There was no one who was kind of checking in with them all the time. They were just told, go off and be brilliant and creative. One of the most enjoyable and interesting aspects of team and group studies is how a group develops. And the most famous explanation of this was put forth in the 1960s by a scholar named Tuckman. And Tuckman said there's 5 stages. And the first stage is called orientation. And this means you get acquainted with one another. You start to get to know each other a little bit better. You start to discover how much or how little you have in common in the larger context of the team or the group and its work. That's orientation. Next phase is called struggle for power. And that's when, all right, we know each other a little bit. We know our strengths and weaknesses perhaps a little bit. Who's going to kind of have some power in this group? Who's not going to have as much power in this group? Who's going to kind of be the person who's sort of more often than not the opinion leader? Who's going to take over what set of duties or roles in this team? That's called struggle for power. And then we have the next phase, which is called cooperation and integration. And in this phase, the team has kind of figured out, who we are, what we have to offer, who we can count on to do what. And now let's start establishing some norms, some standards, patterns of behavior that can be distinctive of our work together. And then the next phase, stage 4, is called unity in action. And that's when we bring it all together and we're really doing our work very well. In American English, we say we're humming like a Swiss watch. We're cooperating with each other, yes, but we're doing our work very well. We're able to rely on each other. We're able to rely on those patterns that we've established in stage 3 as being very good ones. We'll change them if we have to, and we can do that very quickly and easily. And then finally, the 5th stage is we come to the end of our lifespan as a group. It's called closure and completion. And we go our separate ways. Maybe if there's, let's say, 6 people in the group, 2 people leave the organization. 1 person gets a new job, 1 person retires. There's 4 people of the original 6. 2 new people come in, new to the organization. We have to kind of go through the whole process again because it's not the same group that it was before because the people are different. Now, what people like about Tuckman is he has a kind of a cute set of nicknames for these stages. So the first stage, orientation, getting to know each other and finding out who's got experience doing what, that's called forming. The next stage, struggle for power, is called storming, like a thunderstorm. Third stage, cooperation and integration, that's called norming. And as I was saying, this is the point at which we figure out what are the patterns going to be that we're going to follow. Fourth stage, unity in action, where we finally can start really doing our best work. That's called performing. And then we have the closure and completion phase. That's called adjourning. So it's forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning. I guess there was no word that sounded like orning to mean completion and closure. The next couple of slides are called group properties. And there are 5 group properties, meaning 5 points of analysis to be able to talk about what's working and not working well with a team. So the first property is called roles. On every team, there are roles that members hold or that members perform. And, leader is a role, but follower is a role. Another example of a role is, might call it moderator. So if you're at a meeting and you got 6 people in the meeting in the group, a moderator role is that role that gets taken over by someone who is kind of saying, hey, John, we've heard a little bit from you already. Let's hear from Pete. We haven't heard from Pete. The moderator kind of coordinates the action. Another role might be the person who knows exactly when to make a joke, when the discussions get a little bit too intense, or maybe people feel a little bit dispirited because they're not making progress as a group and moving toward a decision. Someone who knows exactly how to make just the right quip, the right clever remark. That's a role that is being fulfilled by that person. We need someone to be what's called, in American English, we call it the safety valve. So teams have roles. And another property, the second property, is norms. We've already talked about that. Groups have norms of behavior, and a good group sticks to the norms. A good group also can change a norm if it no longer is considered useful or appealing. Group property number 3. I forgot one thing. The next slide is negative norms. We kind of imply that norms are these good things, but you can have norms that are not appealing, and they're still norms because maybe people just don't know how to break out of those. So just an example might be verbal or physical abuse, bullying. You could have a team of 4 people, and 2 of the people are continually making fun of the others, bullying them, teasing them, disparaging them. Well, that becomes a norm for that group. I just want to take a quick sip of water. Boy, I needed that. Verbal and physical abuse or bullying, that could be a norm in that group. That's probably not a happy group. It probably is not an effective group. That's not appealing behavior to too many people, but it is the norm for that group, and it's a negative norm. Wasting resources might be another example. Other groups are very careful about not keeping the lights turned off when they're not in the building. Only using a few sheets of paper instead of using 15. They don't waste resources, but on another group, nobody cares about that. That's not that appealing. That's, that could be expensive for the organization. It's a negative norm. So some norms are, I should say it this way, not all norms are appealing, attractive, uplifting norms. Group property 3 is status. So you have high status and low status members of a group. High status members of a group often have a little more freedom in the group to express themselves perhaps. Lower status members of the group often tend to be quieter, maybe even are stigmatized a little bit. One example I can think of high status and low status, again, I go to a military example. In the U.S. Army, there are something called fire teams, and a fire team consists usually of 4 guys, maybe 5. But one guy carries a very heavy automatic weapon. A second guy is the assistant gunner, the AG, who helps the gunner with that heavy automatic weapon. The AG carries a lot of extra ammunition, for example. And then you have two riflemen, and they carry just, standard weapons. And what happens is the 4 or 5 guys work together to attack enemy positions. There are 2 or 3 other fire teams they're kind of coordinating their work with. Well, let's imagine you got a fire team of 4 people, and let's say that one of the 4 is high in rank, and the other 3 are lower in rank than that first guy. But let's say that first guy has never been in combat, and these guys here, even though they're lower in rank, they've been in combat for 8 months. Well, that high-ranking guy actually is going to have low status in that particular group, because what's most important to them is not who has what rank insignia, but who knows what he's doing when the bullets are coming at you. And a person who's brand new to combat doesn't always know. So high status, low status. Back at camp, away from where the bullets are flying, maybe the higher ranking guy has high status and the lower ranking guys don't. But out there downrange in the field, they have the higher status. So talking about who has high status and why, who has low status and why, that tells you something about a team. 4th group property is called cohesiveness. And this is how willing members of a group are to be together, to work together. You don't have to love or even really, really like the other members of your team, but you do have to be willing to be with them rather than do your best to not spend any time with them. You have to be motivated to stay in the group, and one way of getting motivated to stay in the group is by trusting the other people, liking them well enough that you're okay with being there. But cohesiveness is a factor, a result of simply being willing to be with the other people rather than not be with them. And the final property is, group property, is diversity. And there's 2 types of diversity I want to tell you a little bit about. There's diversity of identity, first of all, and that means that the members of the group, let me say this differently. Let's imagine a group, 5 people, and let's say that every one of the 5 people is a white guy from the United States over the age of 40. Well, that's not particularly diverse. Diversity means difference, divergence, non-similarity. More diverse means more different, less similar. Less diverse means less different, more similar. And in the example I just gave, you don't have a very diverse group in terms of diversity of identity. And now let's say another 5-person group. Let's say one person in the group is a white American guy over the age of 40. But let's say that another member of the group is an African with dark skin from Somalia. And let's say a third member of the group is a Latinx woman who is in a wheelchair because she's paralyzed from the waist down. These are all different, divergent, diverse identities, identities of race, identities of sex or gender, identities of physical capacity or limitations on physical capacity. And the idea is that diversity of identity is beneficial to a group because it implies diversity of perspective. And that's the other kind of diversity. Diversity of perspective talks about not so much diversity that you can see, but diversity that is represented by divergence, non-similarity of beliefs, life experiences, attitudes, those kinds of things. And you want to have, at the very least, you want to have diversity of perspective. And the reason that diversity of identity is prized and appreciated and sought is because it often is part and parcel of diversity of perspective. So you want to have a more rather than less diverse group as a general rule. Okay, another piece of the puzzle here in understanding groups is decision making. And, to make decisions is really kind of the main reason any group exists. If a group is about solving problems, creating something that doesn't yet exist, innovating, addressing challenges that have to be overcome, every step along the way in those kinds of activities involves decision making. We have to decide as a group, are we going to go this way or that way in order to pursue the goals? We have to decide as a group, do we want this candidate that we just interviewed to become a part of our group, or do we want to reject him or her and thank him or her for interviewing, but we're probably okay as it is right now? All of what a group does can be described by the concept of decision making all along the line. Group work is decision making work. Well, there's some strengths and weaknesses associated with decision making in groups. So one of the strengths that groups bring to the task of decision making, one of the strengths is fuller knowledge, fuller information than you'd get if you had to make a decision on your own, or if it was just you and one other person who had to make a decision. A group really provides a great deal of information. It can provide a great deal of information. An example of a weakness in decision making that a group has to face is what's called conformity pressures. Conformity pressures means that members of a group often pressure one another to conform to those norms, to maintaining the same role again and again and again. There's this conformity to not offer diversity of perspective, oftentimes. That's not a healthy group, but it's certainly very real as a possibility. So group decision making is, let me say that differently. So the strengths and weaknesses that groups bring to the task of decision making is important to take into account when you're understanding what's going on in a group. And finally, we've been talking a little bit about groups and teams. We've used the words somewhat interchangeably, but I don't want to do that any longer. I want you to think about these terms, group, team, being different from one another. And let's compare and contrast very briefly. First of all, let's talk about identity. Let me back up. Let's talk about standards of performance. The standards of performance in a group are solid and acceptable. The standards of performance for a team are high standards of excellence. Team members embrace, quite often, very high standards of excellence in their performance. The skunk works I was telling you about, one of the reasons they were so successful was that, just coming in to work one day and not having an idea or not helping someone flesh out a new idea, unacceptable, That was a team that existed primarily to innovate, to make decisions about a new product, a new design that was innovative and really exciting. So you'd come into you'd come in for the day in the skunk works, and if you said I just can't get my brain to work today, I can't be creative today, someone would say, all right, that's all right, you don't be creative, you don't have to be creative, but you better help me. Let me bounce some ideas off you. Oh no, I don't want to bounce ideas. No, you can't do that. In the skunk works, you have to say, yeah, okay, bounce the ideas off me. Let's work this out. Let's talk about this. High standards of excellence in performance. You never let up. You never call it quits. That's team consciousness. Leadership on a team and leadership in a group, usually different. Leadership in a group often is designated, the leader is designated by outsiders to the group who are insiders to the organization and in executive or management positions in the organization. They will often say, okay, you are going to be the leader of this group. Leadership in a team often is shared. Maybe one person on the team, more often than not, finds himself or herself in kind of a leadership role. But that person is absolutely willing to step out of that role if someone else wants to experiment with being a leader. Someone else is maybe more appropriate to be a leader for a given task. So leadership is shared, it's more fluid. And also it is what's called principled leadership, meaning it's based on some very specific, unshakable principles guiding ethical behavior on the part of the leader, ethically responsible behavior. Third area of comparison and contrast is purpose of a group versus purpose of a team. And generally speaking, the purpose of a group is nested within the purpose of the organization. So the other day we talked about purpose, vision, mission, and values of an organization. And that together becomes the driver of the tasks that are laid out, the missions, the activities that are embarked upon by members of the organization. Well, those also become the basis for articulating what the purpose of a group is. So we talk about the purpose of a group often is nested inside the purpose of the organization. Purpose of a team is not always that way. The purpose of a team enhances the organization. It is congruent with, it matches up with the purpose of the organization. But often it brings new ideas into the organization. The purpose of the team may be apart from meeting whatever goals they have and that they had to reach, the team brings in some absolutely new ways of operating that the organization at large had never really thought of before. Well, that's a team for you. It's like a value-added group experience. And then finally, the distribution of tasks, the allocation of jobs and work assignments. In a group, generally speaking, the leader of the group does that. In a team, quite often that's a shared responsibility. You'll have a team meeting and maybe someone will say, you know, last week I did such and such. I don't know if I want to do that this week. Would anybody else like to take over for me with that? And someone will step up and say, sure, I'll do that this week. And so who does what kind of work is indicated by the group leader. It is shared by the team members. And that's really the last thing I want to talk about except for one, and that is what's the top number for a team. Because we talked about 3. Well, different scholars have different opinions about that. I can think of things I've read where the specialist in team said, 20 people in a team, 20 people in a group. That's about it. Other people have said 12. Other people have said different numbers. Here's the way I think of it. If you were to imagine looking at a dry erase board, like in the classroom, and I put 3 dots on that board, and I said, how many dots are there? You look at that board, you'd instantly know there were 3. Let's say another day came and I put 4 dots on the board, and I said, how many dots are there? You go, boom, 4, instantly, you recognize it. 2, 1, instant. Now, let's say that I put 17 dots on the board, and you didn't count them. I just, I had them on the board, and then I just maybe pulled away a piece of paper that had been covering them, and I said, how many are on the board? You go, let's see, 1, 2, 3. Or maybe you go, let's see, 3 there, 2 there. You'd have to count them. Nobody can just instantly recognize 17. You'd have to be some kind of pattern recognition genius of all geniuses to be able to do something like that. Well, that ability to recognize instantly a certain number of elements is called subitizing. So we can subitize 3, 4, definitely 2, definitely 1. We can subitize that. Five, a little bit more difficult for some people, but not terribly difficult. Six, a little more difficult. Seven starts to get kind of difficult. You can train yourself, by the way, to increase the number that you can supertize. You can train yourself. But even if you do, it's very difficult, studies have found, to supertize more than about 9. And many years ago, there was a very famous article that addressed all this, and it was called 7 plus or minus 9, the magic number. And what that meant was if you have 7 and you go 7 plus or minus 2, that's 7, and then minus 2 is 5. 7 plus 2 is 9. So between 9 and 5, that's when it starts to get a little more challenging to supertize for most people. So that's how I have come to think about what the upper limit of people on a team is, a group or team. 9. So 3 to 9. Because more than 9, it's really difficult to supertize. When you get to 10 or higher, that's the number that I think of as constituting an organization. Now, there's some leeway in here. You can have an organization that consists of 8 people, a small business, an owner and the owner's spouse, and 8 employees, that's 10. 6 employees, that's 8. That's below 9. Is it a team, or is it a group, or is it an organization? Well, it's a little bit of all of those. You can have a team consisting of 2 people in the sense that maybe the team starts out with 3, but one of the people is sick and just has to go in the hospital for a really long time, and you get a email one day or text message from your boss and said, look, there were 3 of you in this group. It's going to have to just be the 2 of you now because Joe is going to be on sick leave for I don't know how long. Well, is it a team or is it a relationship? Well, the answer is it's got element or group relationship. It's got elements of both. If 2 people start an organization, like Google was started by a guy named Larry and a guy named Sergey. 2 people. It's an organization, right? Well, yeah. It's a relationship, right? Well, yeah, that too. So these numbers are not absolutely hard and fast. But to help you kind of navigate these waters, 2 people's a relationship, 3 to 9 is a team, 10 or above organization. But for today, again, I want to emphasize 3 to 9 is a team because that's the outside range by which most people can supertize. All right, very good. We will see you later.